Hello everyone, I'm Jane Sanderson. Now, if you watched the previous introductory video, you'll know that I don't do fancy videos, I don't do clever software, I don't have special effects. It's just me here in my clinic talking to you, where I work with most of my clients who have type 2 diabetes. And it's likely that you're here because you have type 2 diabetes. Maybe you have pre-diabetes and you're finding it a bit of a struggle, which it absolutely is. And many people with diabetes try very hard to manage it, but they can't. And if that's the case for you, then just keep watching this video because it may well address the reasons why you're not really getting on top of the diabetes. Now, when I was training and helping to treat people with type 2, it struck me that the treatment that they often received prior to coming to me was quite brutal. I mean, don't get me wrong, I know people have to be kept safe, but one thing that they all shared in common was a real want to get better, but an inability to do that. And they kept feeling bad about themselves because they weren't managing. People would say to me that I eat healthily, I try to keep away from sugar and carbohydrates, but they craved those things constantly. And they would try and exercise, but it wasn't working. And some were actually on really restrictive eating plans and still finding that they just weren't losing weight. And that's really distressing. It led to a lot of anxiety and even other health problems as well. You know, these people were not lacking in willpower. They weren't looking for a quick fix. They were prepared to work at it. It was almost as if their body just wouldn't respond. So after a lot of digging around and a lot of research, I discovered why this was, and it struck me how much easier would life be for people with type 2 diabetes if we could address this problem. What if I could correct this imbalance so that the methods that I use and the support that I offer my clients made their journey much, much easier so that they didn't have to suffer the side effects of medication or carbohydrate withdrawal, and they didn't have to follow unrealistic diets and exercise like a ninja in the gym and have to keep worrying about the long-term health implications of having diabetes. The implications of being able to do that were pretty phenomenal. And you know, that sounds like a big claim to make, but actually it was quite simple. So before I discuss this any further, I think it's probably a good idea to talk about type 2 diabetes as a condition. So one thing to remember is that diabetes itself isn't actually an illness. It's a whole set of responses to your body having too much sugar trapped. So why is it happening? Well, the chances are that it was happening for years, and it's a bit harsh to say it's all your fault. I mean, yeah, to an extent, lifestyle does play a part, but so does your genetic makeup, so does your family history. Otherwise, everybody that liked cake would get type 2 diabetes, and we know that's not true. And it's the same with being overweight as well. You can be overweight and have diabetes, but you can be diabetic and not overweight. And actually, having diabetes can make you fatter as well. In order to manage your blood sugar and your diabetes effectively, it's vital that you understand the role of the hormone insulin, because that is the biggest problem with diabetes and high blood sugar. So bear with me for a while I give you a quick basic lesson in insulin, and this is where I start with my clients, and it is really important. So insulin is a hormone that's made by the pancreas, and the pancreas is located behind the stomach, surrounded by the small intestine, the liver and the spleen. And the job of the pancreas is to take the glucose or sugar out of the bloodstream and knock on the door of your cells, asking for the cells to accept the glucose from the blood, therefore lowering the level of the sugar or the glucose in your blood. Now, cells are usually very happy to do this because they convert that glucose to a number of nutrients that help your body to function correctly. And the insulin is happy for this exchange because if the insulin can get the glucose out of your blood and into the cells, then this keeps your blood sugar at a nice manageable level. And most of the time this works quite well because every cell in our body needs glucose. Without glucose, the cell can't function correctly, and without insulin, glucose in the blood can't get into the cell to make the cell work correctly. So this insulin-glucose cell relationship should actually be a good balanced one. So how does the glucose get into the blood? Well, basically by the food that we eat. The higher the sugar level of the food we eat, the more sugar or glucose will be in our blood. But that sugar doesn't just come from cakes and sweets. You might be surprised to know that fruits and vegetables have sugar in them as well, sometimes quite a lot, which is why those with diabetes are told to restrict their carbohydrate or their sugar intake. Now, the cells in our body actually do need this glucose for energy and for nutrients, so we do need a small amount of carbohydrates in order to feel and to keep well. And one role of insulin is to make sure that the glucose in our bloodstream gets into our cells. So try to imagine insulin as being a key that fits into the lock of the cells, and that unlocks the cell and allows glucose from the blood to come in where it's used by the cells. And usually our body is quite clever. It can calculate how much insulin is needed to be made to let the right amount of sugar into our cells. But sometimes the insulin key doesn't fit the lock of the cell door, so no glucose can get in. And the actual process as to how we get to that stage is quite complex, but basically cells sometimes stop responding to insulin correctly and won't accept any requests for new glucose. And this is called insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is the underlying cause of almost all cases of type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. And insulin resistance can be going on for months, sometimes years, prior to you actually being diagnosed with having diabetes. Now, at the moment, there's no actual definitive test for insulin resistance, but GPs and other practitioners like myself might look at high density and low density lipid profiles in your blood profile, because certain levels will strongly suggest insulin resistance. Now, to counteract this resistance, the insulin starts some sort of bully boy tactics and begins to make more insulin and tries to use all that insulin to force glucose into the cells. So that keeps the sugar out of the blood. Now, to stop that, the cells become even more resistant. Now, not only is the door of the cell closed, but all the locks have been changed. And the more insulin is made, the more resistant the cells actually become. Now, the problem here is it's okay for a while. Cells can live with a bit of excess glucose stuck inside. It's not a problem for a bit. But over time, it does become a problem. The cells aren't taking in nice fresh glucose to use effectively. They're just stuck with all the old rotting stuff. And you know what damaged sugar does when it's left? It rots things. It inflames them. And the sugar in the blood is getting higher because the insulin key doesn't fit the lock anymore and the sugar can't get into the cells. And because the cells aren't getting nice fresh glucose that they can convert into all sorts of things that make the body work properly, you start to feel ill. Your blood sugar is constantly high. You start to put on weight. Your blood pressure goes up. You get depressed. You get digestive issues, sleep problems. It even affects your skin. It makes you more wrinkled. And it affects your sex life because a lack of libido and erectile problems go hand in hand with insulin resistance as well. So, it's not fun. Now, eventually, the overload of glucose has stimulated enough insulin to flood the liver, and that makes new fat molecules, which engorge the liver to a point where it becomes enlarged. And the insulin is still trying to force glucose in. So the liver cells protect themselves by increasing their insulin resistance. So no one wants this insulin anymore. So in a nutshell, you've got excess glucose, sugar in the blood, a lot of aggressive insulin trying to force its way into cells that are already overloaded with old rotting glucose. And because insulin can't get rid of excess sugar in the blood, it just forces it into other cells in the body, into the eyes, the heart, the nerves, the kidneys. And over time, these organs start to fail from too much glucose. And that's one of the reasons diabetics have regular checks on things like eyes, kidneys, nerves, peripheral nerves in the feet, etc. So in our bodies, excessive sugar has led to too much insulin, which kind of begs the question as to why one treatment of diabetes is to give even more insulin. But you know what, that's another subject altogether. That's another video. The problem with type 2 diabetes is that there's too much insulin and too much glucose, which is associated with many diseases like cardiovascular disease and kidney disease. 50% of diabetics will die as a result of cardiovascular disease. Now, if you think in the UK, that's 4 million people have diabetes, last count. So 2 million of them are likely to die from cardiovascular disease. There's 29 million people in the United States with type 2 diabetes. So that's a lot of people. It really is. Standard diabetic medication like metformin, for example, that will lower the blood sugar while you're taking it. But if we were to remove excess sugar and reduce insulin resistance to the point where everything worked effectively, that would make a huge difference. It really would. And this is not new. In the last 10 years or so, there have been several books written about insulin resistance. The problem is that there isn't any medication that directly switches off that insulin resistance effectively. So to keep you safe, you're going to be prescribed drugs such as metformin, which help to keep blood sugar lower. But it doesn't remove the diabetes because you still have this internal argument going on with cells and insulin. And over time, you have to have more and more medication. But you're just as much at risk for diabetic complication. So even if you're taking medication to manage your blood sugar, you're still diabetic. Because without the medication, the high blood sugar returns unless you address the insulin resistance. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against having that medication. It does keep you safe. And I predict eventually, in the not too distant future, I hope, there will be something that is really effective against insulin resistance. But in the meantime, there are other things that can be done. What we need to do is address the imbalance that's created by cells not having the correct nutrients that it needs to function correctly. It stands to reason if our cells aren't getting nutrients, then we could give them the nutrients that they need, which will encourage our body to function better, be less resistant and more sensitive to insulin. And that way, our bodies wouldn't struggle so much when we were trying to manage our diabetes and our blood sugar. Wouldn't that be good? The consequences of that are quite phenomenal, really. For a start, we'd find weight loss easier because too much insulin makes you fat. And our cells would start doing their job again, and we wouldn't be stuck with all that glucose rotting our organs. And many people with diabetes are trying to find answers, the perfect fix. But actually, it's a lot more simple than that. We need to ready the body to prepare for sorting out the diabetes, because people who have diabetes have problems within the cells, which makes the body very resistant to improvement. And if your cells don't have nutrients, you're going to be hungry. So it stands to reason that before you put that person into a position whereby they have to remove high energy foods like carbohydrates from their life, you've got to get those cells to a point where they stop craving those things, or the person will struggle big time. When I first started treating people with diabetes, their previous experience just seemed brutal. They felt like they weren't doing enough, that they didn't have enough willpower because their diabetes wasn't being managed. And I hate to hear that, because it's just not true. I don't want people to feel that in order to manage this, they have to live on dust, and if they dare to eat something, they feel really bad. You should never call yourself bad. Our body is not able to manage changes that we need to implement, because the diabetic body craves sugar and it craves carbohydrates. But it doesn't do that because a person is bad and has no willpower. It craves largely because it doesn't have the correct nutrients. A degree of willpower, it's always necessary in any aspect of health and wellness, but the body needs to be well enough to make radical changes, and those changes need to be taken in fairly small steps. Otherwise, it will only be effective for a very short time, and then people can't cope. It's like anything, detox, juicing, very low-calorie diets. It's really quite hardcore, and even more so with diabetics, and I think that this aspect is very much overlooked. I mean, you may have seen the TV show The Fast Fix, which was about reversing type 2 diabetes, and they put all these people in a controlled environment for about 6 weeks, and they gave them a really restricted low-calorie diet, and it worked. They all had massive improvements in diabetes, but oh my goodness, it was brutal. Their bodies struggled. They were filmed crying. They were cold, they had constipation, exhaustion. It was awful to watch. They all had insulin resistance, so their cells were starved of nutrients, and no one found the experience anything other than very, very difficult, even though it worked. Our brains are smart. If something is that difficult and makes you feel that bad, even if it works, you're not going to keep doing it. You can't. But don't worry. My strategies for managing your blood sugar don't involve anything as drastic as, locking you up with a very low calorie diet and a camera crew, I promise. I'd rather concentrate on giving your cells the right nutrients so that you don't suffer while you manage your diabetes. Most clients, when they come to me, they're pretty stressed out with diabetes, both physically and mentally, because diabetes has quite a devastating effect on the body. It makes it hard to absorb nutrients for food. There's an excess of sugar where it shouldn't be, and sugar's very inflammatory. So there are lots of niggly problems going on as well. Headaches, tiredness, depression, joint issues, digestive issues. And often, if they're taking medication, there could be side effects from that as well. So it's not pleasant. So getting people to feel better, less stressed and more in control is a key factor. So how do we lower insulin resistance and balance the blood sugars? Well, to begin with, we need to treat the imbalance that's going on within the cells. And I always begin with decent supplementation. And I don't mean taking a multivitamin. I mean a proper supplement protocol specifically designed for an individual to encourage insulin sensitivity and regulate the blood sugar. And you do need to be careful with supplements. Just because you can buy them off the shelf doesn't mean that they're necessarily safe for you as an individual. Some interact with other medications, and that's one of the reasons I do full medical history. Some contain fillers that interfere with blood sugar. So for that reason, I'm not going to give a full supplement list that I might use, but I can suggest one that is safe and effective, and that's chromium. Now, almost all people with type 2 diabetes are deficient in chromium, and chromium deficiency reduces the body's ability to use carbohydrates effectively. So it increases the need for insulin, which is just the thing we're trying to avoid. Now, it's not a quick fix because cells take around 12 weeks to regenerate, but results in my experience and in research are very positive, with the average decrease in blood sugar being around 19 milligrams per deciliter. That's after about 12 weeks. That's pretty good. Now, if you want to take chromium and you have type 2 diabetes, you need a dose of around 800 to 1,000 micrograms, not milligrams, micrograms a day. And that will be necessary. You may always need it, but it's safe and it's relatively cheap as well. Now, there are several other supplements that are extremely helpful. As I said, it's difficult and not really responsible for me to suggest them all without knowing your full medical history. And it's also important to realize that although supplements are effective, other things are needed to fully support the body and do an effective job in reducing that diabetes. Supplements alone are a great ally, but to really ramp things up, you've got to bring out the big guns. Now, I work, as I've said before, in herbal medicine, and we have around 200 odd bottles of herbal medicine here. Each one does different things. They all have a different therapeutic effect. And what's really good is that you can mix them up. So you can create from several different medicines one totally unique and bespoke medicine for someone, like I did for Sarah. Now, Sarah had type 2 diabetes, she had high blood pressure, and she suffered from exhaustion as well. She also struggled a lot with carbohydrate cravings, which it's not unusual in diabetes. As I said earlier, cells are starved of nutrients. So I made her up a herbal medication that was able to address all of those things. So reduce sugar craving, help lower the blood pressure, balance out the blood sugar. So you can address all those different points. And I also added herbs that help with insulin resistance. And in addition, added supplements and just a few lifestyle changes, which we can talk about later. And now, she's back at work. She couldn't work before. Her blood pressure and her blood sugar are in the normal range. Her weight's reduced. Now, the mix that I made her will only work properly for her. It wouldn't have been as effective on somebody else. So just a note here. If you do take herbal medicine, you need to consult a qualified medical herbalist. You know, the stuff that you buy in health food shops, it's very weak. It has to be. But if you go to somebody who's qualified, they can give you the strong stuff. This herbal medicine's powerful, and it can interact with other drugs as well. And Sarah, like many others, she did stay on medication for a while. Then she was able to come off of it. And I could support that because, you know, I can prescribe herbal medicine safely alongside current pharmaceutical medication. Now, there's lots of information on the internet about herbs and diabetes. You'll see things mentioned like cinnamon, gymnema, berberine, romania, all great herbs. I use them. But you need to know which ones. One of those on its own isn't going to completely clear diabetes up. It might be an ally, but it's not going to do the job on its own. So you need to know which ones. You need to know which strength to use and who to use them on. Otherwise, it's just a waste of money and it could be harmful. Some will lower your blood sugar in the same way that metformin will, but they'll increase insulin, and we definitely don't want that. You know, it's important to consider quality as well, because I always use high quality, preferably organic herbs, so that I know I haven't got to worry about things like pesticides and other nasties being present in the herbal medicines that I make. Cinnamon is probably the one herb that's safe to use without supervision, and it does have good results in decreasing fasting blood sugar without interfering with insulin levels. But again, go with caution, because when herbs work by reducing blood sugar, if you're already taking medication to lower your blood sugar, you could end up with a very big dip in your blood sugar. You know, the cinnamon that you buy for cooking is the cassia version of cinnamon. Now that contains something that's called coumarin, and that's a compound that in high doses, and it's got to be quite high, but even so, it can cause problems with the liver. So I would avoid that. If you want to try cinnamon, use the less common Ceylon cinnamon. You know, it's a bit more expensive, but it is a lot lower in coumarin. My honest advice, though, with herbal medicine is get professional advice, which will, one, keep you safe, and two, have maximum effect as well. You know, so our objective is to get blood sugar managed to a point where someone's body is not diabetic by decreasing insulin resistance. And as well as that, we address other ongoing health problems such as weight, cravings, side effects of medication, blood sugar, maybe depression and sleep issues. And so far we've used supplements and we've used bespoke herbal treatments, which will really get you a long way and help enormously. But you know, you can turn a corner by something very simple, just by adding a few key lifestyle changes. And when we make lifestyle changes, it's important that we make changes that are sustainable and not too difficult, or we won't stick to them. And they have to form part of your life. I always work with clients to figure out what they can manage, what they definitely can't manage, and try and build in small steps that produces consistently good results. You need to remember that a diabetic body is struggling, and the diabetic response is going to be to crave sugar and other carbohydrates. So you start reducing those and there's a few wobbles can happen. The supplements and the herbal medicine will really support that, but it's not a quick fix. So don't feel bad about taking small steps, and don't feel bad about having the odd break from it, just the odd one. As long as you're sensible, you can enjoy the odd night off. It actually makes things easier for you. And there are several ways that you can start making changes to your diet. But first I ask people, what can they do without? And what can they absolutely not do without? And then we try to make changes around that. Now, obviously, the nutritional aspect of this is huge and really varies from person to person. It could be a whole video on its own, but with the right support, it doesn't have to be hard work. You know, what happens is that the body responds to those small changes quite quickly, and you begin to feel better. Your blood sugar stabilizes, which encourages you to take bigger steps. You know, some people say, oh, I love meat, I could live on meat. Well, that's easy, because dietary protein doesn't increase your insulin. So we can use an eating plan that's based around protein, but for others who don't like meat or they're vegetarian, it's not so easy, but there's still plenty that can be done. So in general, you're looking to have the main part of your food made up of proteins like meat or fish. A medium amount of good fats is okay. Certain cheeses are fine. Cream is better than milk because milk contains more sugar. And remember, fat's not the enemy here, it's sugar. So you want a very small amount of carbohydrates and really try to minimize refined carbohydrates like cakes or sweets. Think of the Atkins diet, but not as restrictive. And as I said, don't worry if you do this in stages. You want something that you can commit to. And eventually you're aiming for a diet that's low in carbohydrates. You'll get there. And you've probably heard about intermittent fasting being very, very successful in reversing type 2 diabetes, and it absolutely is. It's probably the single most effective dietary change that you can make because it really does reduce insulin resistance. But again, it does take some getting used to, and you have to take your general health into consideration and start slowly building up to it. And if you haven't heard of intermittent fasting, it's basically having a very long gap of at least 16 hours between what's usually the last meal of one day and the first meal of the next day. It's worth working on. It's very effective, and it definitely reduces insulin resistance effectively. But at first it can feel a bit difficult. But eventually, once your insulin resistance is lower, you almost don't notice it. You stop being hungry, actually feel better for it. But as I said, takes a bit of practice. And we work with clients on an individual basis with this so that they get to a level that works for them. And some people ask me about things like slimming clubs, Weight Watchers, Slimming World. If you find them beneficial, then yes, do carry on. But they're not designed for insulin resistance. And while your insulin resistance is high, you might find that you don't lose a lot of weight. But you can get a lot of other benefits, and you could combine them with a bit of intermittent fasting, and that will really increase the benefits as well. Now, exercise is, it's not a dirty word, I promise. It's another lifestyle change that you can make. But don't worry, you don't have to spend hours sweating in the gym unless you want to. The amount of exercise is not nearly as relevant as the type of exercise. 10 minutes a day of high intensity exercise that works on reducing insulin resistance in the muscle is very, very effective, as are things like yoga, Pilates, Tai Chi. So as with eating, it's about finding out what's right for you, what you enjoy, what you can fit into your day. One of my clients is training for a half marathon, so her workout's quite intensive. Another does 20 push-ups each day, and that's it.